Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Class 12. Today we'll be talking about neoconservatism with the promised return to Strauss, thinking about his relationship to neoconservatism. Um, Mostly we'll be focusing on neoconservatism as a foreign policy doctrine, but I'll also be talking a little bit about the ways in which neoconservatism overlaps with other forms of conservatism when it comes to economic and domestic policy and social policy in particular. So I wanted to start with neoconservatism with this short video clip that gives, I think, probably a very quick and very helpful nutshell of what neoconservatism is in a kind of like 5 quick bullet points, especially if you are unfamiliar. Oops, my apologies. So today we're going to be looking at neoconservatism, spending some time describing neoconservatism as a theory of foreign policy doctrine and even a theory of international politics. And we'll be looking a little bit at the Bush Doctrine and seeing how these theories actually played out in political practice. Neoconservatism is an area, much like with our discussion of Hayek and neoliberalism, where there is a fairly clear line between the kind of theory of neoconservatism and actual United States policy actions. Um, so let's go ahead and get into it. Thinking a little bit about who are neoconservatives. For the most part, neoconservatism is a theory that doesn't really take place in the halls of higher education or in academia, though there are some notable academics who are neoconservatives like Nathan Glazer, um, various Straussians. Usually when we think of neoconservatism, we're thinking about the kind of a certain strand of foreign policy think tank establishment. We're thinking most obviously people like George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney in the Bush administration, the administration of George W. Bush. But we're also thinking of people like Irving Kristol, who we read for today, the journalist and political commentator, who is known often as the father of neoconservatism. His son, Bill Kristol, the co-founder of the Weekly Standard, now part of the Never Trump Republicans, and a co-founder with Robert Kagan of the Project for a New American Century. Uh, Kristol and Kagan's Project for a New American Century was a neoconservative think tank founded in the mid 1990s that was harshly critical of President Clinton's foreign policy. It called for a benevolent global hegemony for the United States, and many of its founding members and high-ranking officials went on to become important officials and influencers within the Bush administration after the year 2000. They also include, going back a little bit further, Jean Kirkpatrick, the former ambassador to the United Nations under Reagan. She was known for the Kirkpatrick Doctrine, which advocated actually supporting authoritarian regimes around the world if they went along with Washington's aims, and that these authoritarian regimes could be led into democracy by example. And she wrote that traditional authoritarian governments are less repressive than revolutionary autocracies. So again, this like fear of revolution creeping back in here, and more of like a kind of stability and order first, and then move towards democracy if that move happens at all. But in general, we can think of neoconservatives as disaffected liberals. These were members of like the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, but became Republicans because of the growing pacifism in the Democratic Party following the Vietnam War and the embrace of the new social movements of the 60s. They weren't necessarily against the civil rights movement, and they weren't necessarily against anti-segregation efforts. They weren't quite the old school conservatives like Bill Buckley or others in that mold. They weren't staunch segregationists, but they did feel that the Democratic Party had quickly moved to kind of the radical left, this kind of phrase that we still hear today, that they had fully embraced all the radical parts of the 60s and 70s rather than kind of the incrementalism, good Burkean incrementalism, which they viewed, which was the proper legacy of the civil rights movement. They generally hold conservative social and economic policy goals, generally define conservative social policies, traditional families, anti-abortion, anti-marriage equality, etc. Limited government regulations, low tax rates, and this is, I think, is pretty clear in some of the Irving Kristol essays, the Old Truths, Neoconservatism, and the What is Neoconservatism, where he talks about the kind of general conservative trends when it comes to domestic policy. But it's most well known as a foreign policy doctrine, that the United States should be aggressive and militaristic. And so what I want to do is actually break down the kind of theory of neoconservatism, less doing a close reading of the texts like I often do, and more kind of thinking about the actual kind of premises of this theory. So the first premise is that the world is a violent and dangerous place, and that the only way, and you saw this from that video that I played at the beginning, the only way to ensure peace in the world is to have a global hegemon provide stability, that you need some country that is going to exert power around the world, that is going to, and in doing so, will be able to bear the costs of providing for security. They take their fundamental insights from the realist camp of international relations dating back to Thucydides, the world is violent and hostile, or in Kagan's the 1968 piece, words, the world needs a measure of policing. War is constrained not by norms or institutions or goodwill, but by deterrence and power that prevents people from acting aggressively. This is especially the case in a world that is made up of non-democracies. As Kristol writes in the 1976 piece, What is a Neoconservative? American democracy is not likely to survive for long in a world that is overwhelmingly hostile to American values. This is a Manichaean good versus evil world. But they also hold that liberal market democracies are good for lots of reasons, most notably that they're less likely to go to war with each other. As Krauthammer summarizes in the Democratic Realism lecture, democracies are inherently more friendly to the United States, less belligerent to their neighbors, generally more inclined to peace. And there's lots of debate over the democratic peace theory in international relations scholarship. The different reasons have been offered to why democracies don't go to war with each other, from democratic norms, audience costs, the idea that domestic voting populations will punish leaders that get into unnecessary wars, economic costs, they tend to be liberal market, have kind of more or less liberal market orders, and the costs of going to war are going to be high. But regardless, the idea here is that if there are more liberal market democracies, the world would be more peaceful. But there's always that caveat that, like, well, we don't mean like radical French Revolutionary style democracy. We mean like good Burkean liberal market democracies. But they also argue that liberal market democracies tend to be weaker in foreign affairs, that they are mostly unwilling to pay the costs to maintain the global order. This is Kagan's point in the 1968 article about the Vietnam War and America as the global policeman. He's worried that after the Vietnam War, the US would be unwilling to actually pay these costs of maintaining global hegemony. But he also says that this isn't unique to the United States. He writes on page 108 that modern social democracies, whether it be the United States, Britain, or France, cannot do what the most thoughtful students of foreign policy agree it must do. This is partly because, as he makes clear in the later piece, the Neoconservative Persuasion, that as welfare states expand, they become more likely to invest money in social programs, economic programs in the name of equality than in the defense spending or foreign policy spending. So that social democracies tend to shift those scarce resources from foreign policy, from the military, into social spending and to the welfare state. However, they argue that the United States, because of its power as the sole superpower status, especially after 1991, after the end of the Cold War, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the fall of the USSR, right, that this power creates a unique set of responsibilities to first maintain global stability. As Kagan writes, as early as 1968, the truly frightening possibility is that with an American foreign policy that forsakes sustained and limited military commitments, that abandons the policeman's role most of the world has come to expect of us, even while bitterly resenting it, those nations who feel their security threatened will have no alternative but to rely on their own nuclear arsenals. That if the United States doesn't play this role, then we will revert to a kind of Hobbesian anarchy of a war of all against all, where everyone is acting in order to preserve their own security, which is going to lead to miscalculation, war, violence, especially nuclear war. But also they want to promote democratic transitions. Because democracies are more peaceful, there's a unique advantage in encouraging, whether through hard power or soft power, usually hard power, the transitions from democracy to, or autocracy to democracy, sorry. As Krauthammer summarizes on page 15, the spread of democracy is not just an end, but a means, an indispensable means for securing American interests. So they think that there's a moral case for democracy, but they also think that democracy promotion is in the vital national interest. It's not an intrinsic defense of democracy. It is not an intrinsic defense. It's not like a Rousseauian defense of like the legitimacy that can only be achieved through the general, through the people exercising the general will. It is a pragmatic defense of democracy and liberal market democracies, not kind of radical Republican democracies, in order to maintain peace and stability. And the conclusion then is that the US-led world order is both in the United States' vital national interests and promotes world peace. This is not the idea of a benevolent, self-sacrificing servant, but that this role as the United States as this global hegemon is the best way to maintain the vital national interests of the United States. Kristol writes in the Neoconservative Persuasion on page 193, for a great power, the national interest is not a geographical term. A larger nation has more extensive interests. The United States will always feel obliged to defend, if possible, a democratic nation under attack from non-democratic forces. So this is kind of neoconservative theory in a nutshell. And Krauthammer in this lecture on democratic realism distinguishes neoconservatism or democratic realism from three other kind of common foreign policy approaches in the United States. The first is that he distinguishes it from is isolationism. And this is the idea that we should withdraw from the world and that we in general do not have a kind of compelling national interest to be the policeman of the world, but that this is the kind of Ron Paul-esque, like we need to be isolationists, we need to withdraw from the world, we need to hold up in Fortress USA and not kind of encourage blowback. But Krauthammer basically says that this is untenable in a globalized world, right? That we live in an interconnected world, especially with the rise of terrorism, of international terrorism in their view, the rise of globalization, interconnections, communications technologies, that you can't really just wall yourself up in a way, because we are kind of with this complex interdependency of the global system means that we can't really isolate ourselves effectively. The second strand of foreign policy thinking that he contrasts neoconservatism to is what he calls liberal internationalism. This is what he takes as the 1990s foreign policy of the Clinton administration, the faith in the United Nations and other international institutions that is going to create peace, intervening, using the military for humanitarian cases, right? Intervening in Somalia, intervening in Bosnia, intervening in Serbia and former Yugoslavia. The goal here is to create peace through these institutions, but Krauthammer, kind of echoing Schmidt, thinks that such a goal is impossible. He writes on page 8 that to create such a true international community, you have to temper, transcend, and in the end, abolish the very idea of state power and national interest. He then contrasts it with realism. This is the might makes right. This is kind of raw Thucydides, Machiavelli, raw Nietzsche, raw Schmidt, that foreign policy is simply a game of power. There are no moral claims involved at all. But Krauthammer rejects this idea because he does think that liberal democracies are good in the world. As much as he has a kind of pragmatic defense of liberal democracies, he does think that they are also like morally good to have states that respect individual rights and have some level of democratic accountability. So ultimately, he comes to this idea of democratic realism, which most neoconservatives reject the term neoconservative. Krauthammer is no exception. He calls his position democratic realism. And he summarizes this on page 16 as, we will support democracy everywhere, but we will commit blood and treasure only in places where there is a strategic necessity, meaning places central to the larger war against the existential enemy, the enemy that poses a global mortal threat to freedom. This enemy, of course, for Krauthammer, writing in 2003, is Al-Qaeda and Islamic fundamentalism, radical Islamism, political Islamism, and this is the existential threat to freedom. Now, throughout this, and you probably saw this in in the reading, that there is this specter of Strauss haunting neoconservatism, just as communism is a specter haunting Europe in the 1840s. We saw this in Kristol's 1958 piece, Old Truth's Neoconservatism, where he kind of does this gloss on Strauss's What is Political Philosophy, writing on page 142. All of classical, i.e. pre-Enlightenment political thought, agreed that there was such a thing as a best regime, that this was taken to exist in speech rather than in deed. After 1789, politics ceased to be considered as a prudent management of men and circumstances and became the realization of ideas. Political thinking became irredeemably ideological, an imposition of ideas on political life rather than an emergence of policy from living experience. So we see these kind of strands of Oakeshott Burke, the emphasis on experience rather than ideological, rather than abstractions. But what's important here for neoconservatism, I think, and where you get this like closer strand to Strauss that isn't just purely a genealogical account, that like a bunch of neoconservatives listen to Strauss's lectures at the University of Chicago, is this idea of a best regime, is this idea that like liberal market democracies, they do think are the best regime, not always for moral reasons. Again, some of these arguments are purely pragmatic reasons defending liberal market democracies, but they still kind of have this old Straussian throwback to, there is not just the least bad regime, not just a pragmatic regime, but there is a best regime, and it's based on experience. So you get this kind of pragmatism, not based on kind of abstract democratic principles. But we also can see a kind of influence from Strauss into neoconservative thinking, and most kind of scholarship cites this introduction to a book he wrote called The City and Man, which was a series of lectures on Thucydides, Plato, and Aristotle that Strauss gave. And in the introduction to these lectures, he writes, however much the power of the West may have declined, however great the dangers to the West may be, that decline, that danger, nay, the defeat, even the destruction of the West would not necessarily prove that the West is in a crisis. The West could go down in honor, certain of its purpose. The crisis of the West consists in the West having become uncertain of its purpose. The West was once certain of its purpose, of a purpose in which all men could be unified, and hence it had a clear vision of the future as the future of mankind. We no longer have that clarity and that certainty. And that clarity, sorry. And this is from Strauss. And Strauss doesn't go on to make the connection that neoconservatives do, that the purpose of the West, the purpose of the United States, is to provide this global hegemonic force to transition the world into a system of liberal market democracies. The political theorist Wendy Brown has noted the convergence of neoliberalism and neoconservatism here, despite the seeming tensions between these theories. But they do take this idea from Strauss that like we've lost certainty. We are become too soft. We've become too willing to equivocate with evil. We are more willing to kind of negotiate with anti-democratic forces, that we are accommodating ourselves to evil in the world rather than standing up for what we know is to be right, that liberal market democracies are the preferred way to organize the world. So there is this kind of Straussian influence, these shades of Strauss that kind of color neoconservatism. And I hope we get to talk a little bit um, about the Specter of Strauss and the kind of influence of Strauss in discussion section this week. But first, we are going to take a quick break. Go ahead and get a glass of water, use the restroom, go stretch your legs, pause this lecture in some way, and we'll be back in just a moment. And we are back. And so I wanted to talk about in the last part of this lecture here is this the kind of influence of neoconservatism in power. And I think we see this most strikingly in the optional supplemental reading for this week, the National Security Strategy of 2002 under George W. Bush. In the kind of like introductory letter, kind of executive summary of the national security strategy, Bush writes, or one of Bush's writers writes, today, the United States enjoys a position of unparalleled military strength and great economic and political influence. In keeping with our heritage and principles, we do not use our power to press for unilateral advantage. We seek instead to create a balance of power that favors the human freedom, conditions in which all nations and all societies can choose for themselves the rewards and challenges of political and economic liberty. Yes, everyone will choose economic and political liberty. In a world that is safe, people will be able to make their own lives better. We will defend the peace by fighting terrorism and tyrants. We will preserve the peace by building good relations among great powers. We will extend the peace by encouraging free and open societies on every continent. So that you get this sense that, like, in order to provide we are both going to have global hegemony, but also this insistence that peace through the expansion of liberal market democracy. That this is the kind of central tenet of neoconservatism, and this was like the Bush administration's foreign policy document after the September 11th terrorist attacks, right? It really wasn't the Bush administration's foreign policy until September 11th, at least like formally. There was much more of a critique in the Bush administration, including by various high-ranking officials in the Bush administration, a critique of military intervention around the world. The kind of policeman of the world phrase was used as we can't be the policeman of the world. But even as Kristol, called for it, that we have to be the policeman of the world. And so this really changes after September 11th, and neoconservatism kind of becomes ascendant in the Bush foreign policy. And we get a series of foreign policy goals in this document outlined on pages 1 and 2, that the American foreign policy will champion aspirations for human dignity, strengthen alliances to defeat global terrorism and prevent attacks against us and our friends, work with others to diffuse regional conflicts, prevent our enemies from threatening us. Again, this language of prevention we'll talk about in a second. Ignite a new era of global economic growth through free markets and free trade, right? Here's the neoliberalism's convergence with neoconservatism. Expand the circle of development by opening societies and building the infrastructure of development or of democracy. Again, same idea here. Develop agendas for cooperative action with other main centers of power and transform America's national security institutions to meet the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. So this was going to be the guiding principles of American foreign policy in the 21st century, according to the Bush administration. And so we get so it is very much this is the kind of neoconservatism in practice. And it goes on page 15 of this document to outline this idea of preemptive war, that the United States has long maintained the option of preemptive actions to counter a sufficient threat to our national security. The greater the threat, the greater the risk of inaction. And the more compelling the case for taking anticipatory action to defend ourselves, even if uncertainty remains as to the time and place of the enemy's attack. To forestall or prevent such hostile attacks by our adversaries, the United States will act, if necessary, preemptively. This idea that we are not going to wait for an attack, that even if we don't know exactly when or if that attack will happen, that we will act to prevent the hostile foreign power from attacking the United States. So we will take preemptive and preventative military action against potential threats, even before there's an actual concrete threat. And it continues, same page, the United States will not use force in all cases, nor should nations use preemption as a pretext for aggression. Yet in an age where the enemies of civilization openly and actively seek the world's most destructive technologies, the United States cannot remain idle while dangers gather. Again, you get this kind of agonistic Manichaean worldview that there are existential threats to civilization that must be defended and must be defeated, and they can only be defeated through the use of force. And this most famously culminates the Bush doctrines of preemption in Operation Iraqi Freedom, the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This video has not available. Okay. So I will post this. Hang on, we'll go to YouTube to watch this video.
At this hour.
Wait, this is not the one with subtitles. My apologies.
United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases to help with intelligence and logistics to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you. That trust is well placed. The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military. In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality. Saddam Hussein has placed Iraqi troops and equipment in civilian areas, attempting to use innocent men, women, and children as shields for his own military, a final atrocity against his people. I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm. A campaign on the harsh terrain of a nation as large as California could be longer and more difficult than some predict. And helping Iraqis achieve a united, stable, and free country will require our sustained commitment. We come to Iraq with respect for its citizens, for their great civilization, and for the religious faiths they practice. We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people. I know that the families of our military are praying that all those who serve will return safely and soon. Millions of Americans are praying with you for the safety of your loved ones and for the protection of the innocent. For your sacrifice, you have the gratitude and respect of the American people. And you can know that our forces will be coming home as soon as their work is done. Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities. Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory. My fellow citizens, the dangers to our country and the world will be overcome. We will pass through this time of peril and carry on the work of peace. We will defend our freedom. We will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail. May God bless our country and all who defend her.
Okay, so you can see from that that video that's this
on my orders, coalition
just
target.
It's just replaying. Okay. As you can see from that speech from President Bush, a lot of the kind of tropes that we've been talking about in neoconservatism, whether they are the kind of Manichaean good versus evil, absolute kind of division, the idea that there is an existential conflict that will only be resolved through force, that if we do not act now, that this conflict will be will directly threaten the territorial integrity of the United States, and this whole entire kind of setup here. And as we probably know, oops, I got out of order there. The war in Iraq generated massive amounts of death and instability in the region. Surveys are controversial in terms of the total number of individuals, both American, coalition, and Iraqi, that were killed. For example, the various forms of there's various disputes from the number of Iraqi civilians that were killed that range anywhere from 100,000 between 2003 and 2009 to over 460,000 between 2003 and 2010. Other numbers include over 600,000 excess deaths, so not just including violent deaths, but the people who died due to lack of help, whose deaths would have been prevented had there not have been a violent conflict breaking out in the country. So thinking about, like the destruction of infrastructure, the economic collapse, the inability to get access to healthcare. Despite all of this, mission accomplished was announced as the president flew onto an aircraft carrier to give a speech announcing the end of the war over a decade ago. And there are still American troops in Iraq. There's still violence in the region. But this symbol here, and this is what I want to close on, of the president in a military flight suit landing on an aircraft carrier, giving the thumbs up, declaring mission accomplished, this kind of masculine, aggressive, militaristic affect. Because I think that one of the things that we've been talking about in this class, in this agonistic lens, is the importance of the kind of affective and emotional and dispositional aspects, to kind of use an Oakeshottian phrase, of conservatism. There's this like militaristic performance happening here that I think is important. So that's it in terms of the formal lecture. Some questions to consider as we get ready for discussion sections this week. How does neoconservatism relate to other strands of conservative thinking? Is neoconservatism an agonistic worldview? To what extent do you see Strauss's influence in neoconservatism, and do you see aspects of neoconservatism in politics today? So that's it for today's lecture. I look forward to seeing you all in the discussion section to talk about neoconservatism.